Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
As you know, we made the class a little bit later today because there was a in-person shiva in the backyard of the Weinstock home. Judy never came to this class per se, but she did live a life extremely devoted to Jewish studies for her children, for many other children in the communities that she was a part of, which was Beth Am and by extension B'nai David and Temple Sinai Temple, and it's a obviously big loss for her family, a big loss for this community. So we can dedicate our learning today to the memory of Yehudit bat Libat Sivya Yaakov, and we say Yehi Zichra Baruch, may her memory be a blessing. Okay, we are in the third chapter of Shemot, and kind of lingering in the verse 17, 18 stretch, and I say it that way because we anticipated what Rashi's going to say in verse 18, although I don't know that we actually formally went through it and translated it. Maybe we did, but even if we did, I want to go back to get some of the momentum starting in verse 17 because this all kind of goes in a flow. So if you're in our pagination in the Torah Chaim, it's page Lamed Chet into Lamed Tet, whatever book you're in, third chapter of Shemot, verse 17. God is in the middle of several layers of quotation marks telling Moshe what to tell the elders whom he has gathered. In the middle of that, God is reminding God self out loud what God has declared. So it's either the third or fourth level of quotation marks in the beginning of verse 17. Va'omar, and I, God declared, I'll bring you up. Me'oni Mitzrayim, from the impoverishment, from the deprivation of Egypt. El Eretz HaKnani, to the land of the Canaanites. Va'chiti, va'mri, va'prizi, va'yechavi, va'yebusi. All those other residents of that land. El Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, towards the land that is flowing with milk and honey. We've discussed in different places that the milk here is almost certainly a reference to goat's milk. Cattle were not nearly as common, and the dvash is probably not bee honey, but silan, right? The liquid honey substance that comes out of a date, kind of a date syrup. Most scholars believe that that's what is referred to here as dvash. I don't remember if we formally read verse 18, but before we go there, does anyone have any lingering comments or questions on verse 17 in case we didn't fully finish that? No? Okay. So let's go to verse 18. And Tova, would you mind reading for us? Is Tova there? I can't hear you, Tova, if you're talking. Maybe you're not there. Okay.
No, I'm there. Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
ושמעו לקולך ובאת אתה וזקני ישראל אל מלך מצרים ואמרתם אליו אדוני אלוהי העבריים נקרא עלינו ואתה נלכה נא דרך שלושת ימים במדבר ונזבחה לאדוני אלוהינו.
Okay, it's a big chunk.
All
Let's
right.
see if we can
Big
break it
chunk.
down.
Okay, so let's see. And they will listen to your voice, and you will come, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, you plural will say to him, Adonai, the God of the Hebrews, Nikra, has met us, and you has met us, and now let us go on. Let's see. Now let us go for 3 days. Let us go on the derek. Go on the way for 3 days into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, or to God.
Great. really great. And now that you've translated, reminds me that we did at least start this translation last week, and you were sensitive to all of the specifics of the verse. The fact that the first verb that is addressed well, it's actually the second verb in the sentence, but first we have a singular verb, uvata ata, you Moshe go, even though the Viziknei Yisrael, the elders of Israel, are actually clearly part of that going. And then by the next verb, we're back into a plural verb. So it's a singular verb, maybe focusing on Moshe's individual role there, and then the plural of amartem. You properly lingered over that word nikra. What does it mean to say that God karad upon us, happened upon us? We'll play with that in the Rashi. And then this notion that God's message to Moshe as to what the message to Pharaoh should be is not that we are leaving you permanently, but all we want to do is go out for a 3-day tour like the SS Minnow, which is someone
Right.
last week. Okay, and we will offer an offering to Adonai our God. Okay, Rashi's going to have a lot to say on this verse, and we've kind of anticipated a bit what Rashi's going to say, so I want to get into that soon. But as is always the case, let's linger and see if there's any comments or questions on the verse itself, on the pshat, on the words, before we jump into the Rashi. Okay, the only thing I want to then do before the Rashi is just to hear a couple of different ways in which translations deal with the nikra alinu, because Rashi's going to play with that. So you might be aware in your own mind that kuf resh hey, in at least modern Hebrew, built obviously in ancient Hebrew, has to do with happenstance, a happening, makoreh, what's going on, right? Kuf resh aleph, which pretty much sounds the same, is to call very specifically. It's almost the opposite of kuf resh hey in some ways. And there's always an interesting question as to whether or not either of them is built off of kuf resh, which is cold, right? Which is the opposite of intimacy. I'll read to you Everett Fox's translation, and then if we have any other interesting ones, I'd love to hear them. Everett Fox translates verse 18 the following way: "They will hearken to your voice," that's the Vishamu, "and you will come." And I love how he does this here, because he recognizes that singular verb into the plural verb. You will come, comma, you and the elders of Israel, because he notices that uvata already has the you in it, right? In Hebrew, after you have the uvata, you don't need the ata, which allows the ata of Ziknei Yisrael to be more of a parenthetical clause within commas. You will come, comma, you and the elders of Israel, comma, to the king of Egypt and say to him, quote, Yodhe, he writes it out, YHWH, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. He goes with meet for kara. So now, comma, pray, let us go a 3 days journey. Everett Fox often translates the untranslatable na in Hebrew as a pray, like a softening of a request. 3 days journey into the wilderness, and let us slaughter, and he puts in parentheses offerings to Yud, to YHWH, our God. The reason he does that is that we kind of, it's implied that there's something that's going to be slaughtered. But in the Hebrew, there's no direct object to the root zoveach. V'nizbacha, we will slaughter. What will we slaughter? He puts in parentheses offerings to Adonai, our God. So a lot of interesting translation choices there, including to add in words that are implied but are not actually there. Who has some other interesting translations that they want to share before we look at the Rashi? Larry, you usually have a few interesting ones on the table. Any? Barbara? Can't hear you, Barbara. Can't hear you yet. There you go.
Instead of offerings, I've got sacrifice in two different sources.
Uh-huh. So adding in that direct object. Interesting. Okay. Rick?
What little I know about Egypt is that when they would worship each god, each city had their own little festival, and all the people would gather there. And the 3-day thing, it wasn't just to Ladonai, but it was Ladonai and then Eloheinu, which I always see as the plural also. So to appeal to Pharaoh and the way gods are worshipped there, it would go with what he was used to in what a people would do to worship their God. I don't know if we've covered that before, but I thought I'd throw that in there. And then the whole thing is, well, who gets to go those 3 days? Well, you can go with your elders, but not the kids, and so that's the issue later. Yeah.
Very nice, very interesting way of dealing with why Adonai and Elohim was in there, specifically in the what's going to be addressed directly to Pharaoh. Good. Renee and then Larry Diane.
Saperstein says, they'll listen to your voice. You and the elders of Israel shall come to the king of Egypt and say to him, Hashem, the God of the Hebrews, happened upon us.
Happened, okay.
And now the 3-day journey in the wilderness will bring offerings to Hashem, our God.
Good. So also adds in the offerings as direct object. So we had meet by Everett Fox, happening by the one you just read. JPS translates it, I think it's manifest. Yeah, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, manifested himself to us. One of those is correct, or maybe if you combine them all together, they're correct. Larry, Diane?
So I'll read 3 translations, but then I have a comment, if I can.
Yeah.
Alter says, and they will heed your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and together you shall say to him, quote, the Lord, God of the Hebrews, happened upon us, and so let us go pray 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. So he's a happened. And Aryeh Kaplan says, they will take what you say seriously.
That's interesting.
That's great. He's always interpretive. You and the elders of Israel will then go to the king of Egypt. You must tell him, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, God of the Hebrews, revealed himself to us. Now we request that you allow us to take a 3-day journey into the desert to sacrifice to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, our God. I commented previously, this is the only section where he does that in terms of translating God's name that way. And Art Scroll, I don't think anybody's read Art Scroll yet. Art Scroll says, they will heed your voice. You and the elders of Israel shall come to the king of Egypt and say to him, Hashem, the God of the Hebrews, happened upon us. So there also happened. And now please let us go on a 3-day journey into the wilderness, and we may bring offerings to Hashem, our God. My comment is, there are 3 possibilities that either they discover that one discovers God, I found God, or God reveals God's self to one, which is translated here, or it's passive, which is what's translated in most of the cases. It happened. And I'm reminded of the story that Jonathan Sacks wrote about and told many times, which I'm sure many of you have heard, when he went to go see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was very influential in his life, even though he was not Chabad. And he told the rabbi, the Rebbe asked him, what are you doing, or something like that. And he told him, well, I happen to find myself. And the Rebbe responded, you don't happen to find yourself. And I don't remember the exact words, but it was a diatribe against happening to find yourself and actually actively putting yourself in a position. I'm probably butchering the story only slightly, but the way in which it's translated here in the Nikra, it bothers me that we would be so passive and it would be so happenstance. We would happen to find ourselves, as opposed to wanting that story to be very active. Yeah. Either God revealed God's self, or, and I know it's not part of the story, Moses found God and found a reason to go back to Egypt to free his people, which is the way I prefer to think about it, but it's obviously not there in the story.
Yeah.
So that's my comment.
So much to say there. Just on the last one, I think in the JPS commentary, or the Eitz Chaim commentary, it compares Nikra here to Nir'ah, right? Which would be the more, it's a different root, but it's rather than a happening or a passive manifestation, a revelation, right? So you can compare Kuf Resh Hey to Kuf Resh Aleph, to happen or to call. You can also compare Nikra to Nir'ah. And also remember, and this gets confusing, that we also have to ask the question, not only why is that verb used, but why is that verb used in what God wants to be said to Pharaoh, which might be different than how God wants the Israelites to actually have experienced God's presence, right? Is there something about that it being a happening and not some kind of grand revelation that's significant in terms of what's being communicated to Pharaoh? And Rashi's proof text that we will get to in this class will compare it to Bilam's experience with God. And Bilam's experience with God in Parshat Balak is often contrasted with Moshe's experience with God. So there's going to be a bit of a triangulation here as we play at this root. The thing you said just before that, though, also raised a comment for me, but now I can't remember what it was. Oh, is it Aryeh Kaplan? Is he the one who has the more kind of free-flowing translation?
Yes.
Yeah, he turns it into really wonderful English sentences, which make it easier to listen to, and he makes some really interesting editorial choices there in terms of how he's rendering some of this. Will you read that verse one more time in Aryeh Kaplan?
They will take what you say seriously, period. You and the elders of Israel will then go to the king of Egypt, period. You must tell him, Yud-He-Vav-He, or it actually says YHVH, God of the Hebrews revealed himself to us, period. Sorry. Now we request that you allow us to take a 3-day journey into the desert to sacrifice to Yud-He-Vav-He, our God.
I see. So he's very loud.
So somebody's at the door. Go ahead.
I'm just going to mute you for a second. The way he handles the na was the one I wanted to talk about. That we now make this request. He puts, which is exactly what the na is doing, right? It's representing a politeness, but it's interesting how which English words he uses to translate that small Hebrew syllable. Great. Thank you, Larry. I saw Tova's hand up next, I think. So go ahead, Tova.
Okay. Rick actually spurred this idea. I'd never thought of it before. And if I can get a little historical Egyptology nerdy here for a minute.
Please.
If we are, as is certainly a strong possibility, picturing this, the Delta in the early 19th dynasty of the Ramessids, one of the chief deities is Set, and Set was the desert, which I never thought he's associated with the desert. And not only was he a chief god of the desert, but it is demonstrated that many Asiatics who came and settled in the Delta adopted Set because of similarities with their own gods. So there was an association there. And also that dynasty, because their family came from that area, had adopted Set. In fact, the founder of the dynasty had been a priest of Set. And the second member, the first was Ramesses the first, his son was Seti the first pharaoh in millennia practically to take the name of Set. So invoking particularly that we're going into the desert, it just really hits me that, again, as Rick suggested, a ploy, if you will, to suggest that this is what we're going to worship. But that connection just never occurred to me before, but it's actually very strong historically at that time.
Fascinating.
So.
Really fascinating. That's the kind of insight that you really do need a historian to contribute. That's just not going to. It might be something that you're revealing is present in the text, but the text doesn't lead us there. So that's really. No. Elon, I think, was next, then Joanna.
I want to get back to the word happened, and I agree with you that I think that the use of the word happened is for Pharaoh's benefit, but I might suggest a different reason, which is because happened is passive, it's less threatening to Pharaoh. In other words, the Israelite people were not looking for something. They were minding their own business, going about their daily slave life, and God, they happened upon this, right? They were perfectly content. And so it's far less threatening to Pharaoh than a different interpretation might be.
Interesting. So softening what God might want the Israelites to experience as God's presence in their life. The message is to Pharaoh, we were not, and we are still not looking to leave you, but we have this. It's like we have this. Someone offered us tickets to the game, right? It was someone gave us this opportunity, and we're going to go do it, and we'll be back soon. It's lower stakes. That's really, really interesting, and also something that we'll pick up again when we get to Rashi's commentary on that word nikra. Great, Joanna, and then Rick.
So I'm finding this discussion around, was B'nai Yisrael active or passive quite fascinating. And I agree with the comments about, maybe this is how this is all being presented to Paro. And yet it takes me back to the end of chapter 2 and the discussion of that those last few verses at the end of chapter 2 are very much interrelated and dependent upon each other, that the Israelites groaned, and then the text tells us that God heard their cry. And why then? Because the Israelites needed to be active. They needed to take that first step. And it still puts me, though, in the mindset of where the Israelites are now. Okay, maybe they took that first step and cried out, but they are still suffering. They are still under severe bondage. There's only so much that they can do. And at least according to, rabbinic interpretation, we see that last all the way until they get to the sea. That, they're standing at the sea and nothing is happening. And it takes Nachshon to finally make that first jump in for something to happen. So that need to be active is a process that takes a while to come to terms with and to come to learn how to use that.
Yeah. Right. And still today, right? I just finished Minyan, and I'm trying to think what do I think is supposed to be happening at Minyan? Am I knocking on God's door saying, I'm available now, are you available for a visit? Or am I just is it more passive that is it a passive priming of the pump that I'm just actually putting myself in a situation not to invite God in as if it should be on my schedule, but actually just allow for a happening to happen, right? Because even in English, the fact that a happening happens can be passive or actually priming the pump, so that's like an active decision to prime the pump so that something passive can happen, right? Like a planned spontaneity. I think a lot of relationships, amongst humans and in the spiritual realm, have to do with a planned or primed spontaneity, putting us in a position that a really interesting happening can happen, even if we can't know in advance exactly how or when. I think a lot of beautiful moments emerge that way. And I find that if I look at my own prayer life writ large, it's in that category, that it's not that I have been able to indicate in advance with specificity that I'm going to have a revelatory moment now. I don't really beckon God in that way. Who am I to beckon God? But over a lifetime of being ready for it, open to it, prepared for it, sometimes there is a kuf reish hey happening that feels like a kuf reish aleph calling out. So I do think that those notions are intertwined, and it speaks to the way in which we try to experience God's call or God's presence even today. So thank you for that, Joanna. Rick, and then I do want to get to the Rashi because we've been anticipating the Rashi for quite some time. I want to make sure we actually play into it. Rick.
Just a little bit more on the kuf reish hey or kuf reish aleph.
Yeah.
So if I could remind us, back in verse 16, it was nir'ah Elai with the aleph. Elohei avotechem nir'ah Elai. That's what you're supposed to tell the elders. And the trope there, mapach parsha munasa kekaton. And then here we have nikra. It's what you're supposed to say to Pharaoh. Elohei ha'ivriim nikra with a hey on the end. Aleinu. That's the same trope there. But then when they actually get to Pharaoh in chapter 5, verse 3, The trope is different, so they don't do that like they're supposed to. And then they use nikra with an aleph on the end. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's nikra. Yeah, 5-3. I'm looking right at it.
That is really interesting. I never connected that. Let's look at that for a second. That triple.
And then the trope there, Rabbi, the pazer on the Nil Chana, that's more intense than it was before, where it's just a ger shayim.
Yeah. So if we linger on that for a second, I'm so appreciative of that comment, Rick. Comparing our verse to 5-3, and then we'll go back and compare to the other verse you connected us to, which is the nir'ah. That when the moment that's being anticipated now actually happens, when there's actually an encounter with Pharaoh, and it happens in several stages, right? That there's chapter 5 begins with their speaking to Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh responds, and then verse 3, Vayomru, they said, Elohei Avrim nikra aleinu. So it almost seems like a quote from our verse, right? This notion of the God of the Hebrews, but it's a very interesting switch from Kuf Resh Hey happening to Kuf Resh Aleph calling out, and then a continuation of the language from our verse, right? Let us go 3 days journey, and we will worship our God there. I'm looking to see how Onkelos translates the Nikra there. Fascinating. Itgale. So Onkelos translates our Nikra in our verse, the Kuf Resh Hey, as the Aramaic version of it, Itkare, but translates the Nikra Kuf Resh Aleph in this verse as Itgale, to be revealed. To be revealed. So that's a really worthy thing that I don't have an answer to as to what's going on, such that when the interaction actually happens, Moshe switches from Kuf Resh Hey to Kuf Resh Aleph. Great. Really great, Rick. Barbara?
Sorry, Vered wants to say something, but she can't raise her hand on the machine. So she called me and asked me to ask you to call her.
Who is that?
Vered. Please call on Vered.
Vered, bevakasha.
Rega. Okay, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I have some computer issue. Finally, I was able to get in touch with the group. So Boker Tov. Regarding the verb that we were discussing, I believe that at the end of the last session when we met, I said that this verb means revolution, like hitgalut. And I remember that in the story of Bilam, there is also the same thing in Bamidbar. And it says there, Vaikar Elokim El Bilam Vayomer. So he revealed himself. He appeared in front of Bilam. That verb is not to be understood as Kuf Resh Hey, but we know that in ancient languages, in my research, it says Knaanit. The verb means to, like I say, to reveal, revelation. And the same thing happened in the story of Bilam.
Are you still going, Vered?
No, I'm done.
I couldn't tell if that was a comma or a period.
Okay.
Great. Oh, okay, great. And now that Rick has pointed us to the comparison of verse 5:3 and the question about whether or not Moshe changed the verb, and I guess Larry and Deanne's suggestion of Occam's razor that the simplest answer is the best one, or the correct one, which is similar to the scholarly notion of legio difficultare, that the harder to understand version of the text is probably the right one, because it's more likely that it was changed to a simpler one than changed to a more complex one. Everett Fox translates these two verbs exactly the same. In our verse, the Nikra Kuf Resh Hey is the God of the Hebrews has met with us. And in 5:3, Kuf Resh Aleph, Everett Fox says the God of the Hebrews has met with us. So Everett Fox, who knows Hebrew and knows roots, is with you, Larry and Diane and Occam, saying that this is the same verb, that somehow and do not do not assume that when Letterman changed the hey to an aleph, it was intentional. I'm not so sure, but I'm totally intrigued, and I'd never picked up on that until Rick pointed that out. That it's almost a verbatim except for one letter. Okay, with all of that richness hovering, let's go to Rashi, because we've been yes, thank you, Joel. We've been talking about that for some time. So Tov, I think we're back up to you, and let's get to the Rashi on Vishamu lekolecha, which is going to bring us back actually to something we were discussing the previous week in terms of the persuasiveness of Moshe's argument from the perspective of the Israelites.
I think I'm going to pass the buck on the Rashi. I'm not up to that.
Okay. So, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Joanna, do you want to read the Rashi Vishamu lekolecha? We don't hear you yet, Joanna. Okay.
Sure. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
Sorry, I was still on Exodus 5, just flipping back.
Not a problem. So it's 3:18.
Yes. Vishamu lekolech, mikevan shetomar lahem lashon zeh, yishme'u lekolcha, shekvar siman zeh masor bi'adam miYaakov u'miyosef, שבלשון זה הם נגאלים. יעקב אמר להם, ואלוהים פקוד יפקוד אתכם, יוסף אמר להם, פקוד יפקוד אלוהים אתכם.
Good. And before you translate, this is one of the rare, but it happens, Rashis, where there are several different versions of the Rashi text itself. So the one that we have in the Eitz Chaim, the Torah Chaim begins with the word Mekevan. There are versions of the Rashi that have one word before that as its own sentence, and that word is Me'elehem. So therefore the Rashi would read, Vishamu lekolecha, quote from the verse, and they will listen to your voice, Me'elehem, on their own, of their own accord, and then the commentary that's about to begin. And our version in the Torah Chaim did not have that. And later on in this Rashi, there's an entire comment of Rashi's that appears in some versions of Rashi, but not in our version. So with that in mind, translate from the part that we have in front of us.
Since you will say to them in this language, listen to your voice. They should listen to your voice because they had this as a sign that was passed into their hands from Jacob and Joseph. Because in this language, it was that they would be redeemed.
Right, let me pause you right there. Joanna or someone else, Rashi's now used the word Lashon Zeh, this language, twice. What do we think Rashi is referring to with Lashon Zeh, this language? We were lingering on it last week, but we got distracted with other things in this verse this week. Anyone?
I mean, from the rest of the commentary, he's picking up on the use of the word pakod in all these places.
Pakodity.
Exactly. So we're on verse 18, but if you go back to verse 16, right? We anticipated this verse 18 2 verses, which are probably 3 or 4 classes ago, but we have to remind ourselves of it, otherwise this Rashi won't make sense. Go back to verse 16, beginning of the 5th Aliyah. Lech va'asafta, go gather at Zignei Israel, the elders of Egypt. Ve'amarta alehem, and you say to them, Adonai Elohei avotechem, the God who is the God of your ancestors, appeared to me, Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, meaning God said, this is what I should say to you. And Rashi saying, these are key words. These are like shibboleth, right? It's going to indicate instantly that I come with a certain amount of authority. Pakod pakadati etchem. Tell them, wink, wink, that I, God, said, I verily will remember you. I will verily account you, v'et hasu elechem b'Mitzrayim, and that which is done to you in Egypt. Rashi imagines that we were reading more quickly, and we remember that that's the language that God told Moshe to tell the elders, and that language, Lashon Zeh, will mean that Shamulo Kolecha, they're going to listen to you instantly. For, now keep translating, Joanna.
As Jacob said to them, God will indeed redeem you. And as Joseph said to them, God will indeed redeem you.
Good. So I want to bring up those verses onto the screen. So hold on a second. Okay. So this is not that long ago in our class, right? I think this is before, Joanna, you joined this class, but it was not that long ago. It was pre-pandemic that we did our siyum on the entire book of Breshit. And in the last chapter of Breshit, Parshat Vayechi, we've got some prediction going forward, because ein mu'achar mukdam b'Torah. There's no chronology in the Torah. The Breshit knows about Shemot, and Shemot knows about Breshit in some weird time warpy Mobius strip kind of way. And in verse 24, chapter 50, but at the end of Joseph's life, Vayomer Yosef el Achav, Joseph said to his brothers, Anochi met, I'm dying. Ve'Elohim pakod yivkod etchem, wink, wink, underline, bold. God will verily remember you, or how does it translate here? Will take notice of you. Ve'eladchem min ha'aretz hazot, will take you out of this land, el ha'aretz, to the land, asher nishbat la'Avraham, litzchak, li'Yaakov, to the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then look at the next verse, verse 25, Vayash ba Yosef. This is the kind of the hefil of the word to swear. So this is not Yosef swearing, but making them swear. At the children of Israel, Lemor, saying, Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem, God will verily remember you, take care of you, v'helitem et atzmotai mizeh, and please bring up my bones. So in successive verses, Joseph mentions Pakod yifkod, verily remember, verily take account, and Rashi says, when our verse says Vishamula Kolecha, remember we said that when we first translated this last week, we said this is not a if they listen to your voice, but they will. This is a prediction. It's a nevuah. They will listen. How do I, God, know they will listen? Because they are primed to listen, because they've been told for generations that a redemption is going to come to the language of Pakod Yivkod. Okay, that's the basic shot of Rashi. Can anyone, based on what I just said, recognize like a really good challenge to Rashi, or like a weakness of it? Norm's raising his digital and real hand, which means he's got something to say.
Rashi says this comes one line from Jacob and one line from Joseph, but we have got no Jacob in here. It's all both lines from Joseph.
Right. It's a fascinating thing that Rashi says. And Rashi knows that we're going to go check the verses. And so Rashi knows when we check the verses, we're going to remind ourselves, if we didn't know it by heart, that this is Joseph twice, not Jacob Joseph. Look at footnote 96, at least in our books, right? Joanna, do you have the Torah Chaim in front of you? You don't have.
No, I'm reading from a Mikrot Gedolot.
Okay, so in our Mikrot Gedolot, there is a footnote to this very point. So Baruch Shekivanta, Norm, footnote 96 on the word Miakov u'Miyosef, that this is a sign from the generations from Jacob and Joseph. Footnote 96. B'Shemot Rabbah, in Shemot Rabbah, the Midrash on Shemot, chapter 3, Mishnah 8, it says Rak Miyosef, meaning in the Midrash from which Rashi is ostensibly getting this, it properly says from Joseph and not from Jacob. Umistaber, and the resolution is, it makes sense. Kilo matzinu biyakov mifurash shamar lashon zeh. We do not find, as Norm pointed out, that Jacob ever said this explicitly. Ela matzinu biyosef shamar zeh pamayim. But rather we saw that Yosef said it twice in the very verses that we just looked at. Umefarshim she'amar ma sheshamama aviv. And Rashi's kind of taking some liberty saying, why did Joseph say it twice? Because he said it in his name and he said it in Jacob's name. Ve'ayin, Ramban, and Chizkuni. Look at the Ramban and the Chizkuni who say similar things. So that's the first interesting thing on this comment, that Rashi's bringing a proof text and kind of slipping in there. Jacob did this and Joseph did it. It was just Joseph. The key is that these words were going to instantly indicate that something, that this is a believable, verifiable redemption story. Okay, let me pause here for comments and questions, and I want to add one other thing that's not on our page that's contributed on a midrashic level here. Anyone? Larry, Diane?
Well, just briefly, this is a question of what we talked about. I think Diane mentioned it before, passwords or signaling or whatever. So in defense of Rashi, I think it happens quite often that if you use certain language, you're signaling to someone that they know it. The examples I can think of are both in the positive direction and negative direction. When Diane and I interject Hebrew phrases into our speech to Hebrew speakers, it basically signals, hey, we speak a little Hebrew at least, or we have that same background. To non-Hebrew speakers, they're really annoyed. Yeah. Why are you using words like dafka, which I don't understand, which I personally can't translate into English very well anyways, but then they gets them annoyed. Diane's father also had an expression he used to use when he was satisfied. He used to say, my sufficiency is serensified, which doesn't really mean anything, but anybody in our family who hears that knows we're talking about Diane's father, Zichrono Livracha. So signaling matters, and signaling in this case, you assume could be passed down through the generations.
Rabbi Pressman of blessed memory liked to wish me salutary sabbatical salutations, right? Because he loved words, and he loved English, and he loved alliteration, and that was more lyrical than Shabbat Shalom. And so when I wish people salutary sabbatical salutations, I'm either being like annoyingly verbose or keying to people that I remember Rabbi Pressman and I honor him, right? And we do a version of this all the time, and we do it unconsciously. I'm totally aware as a conservative rabbi that when I'm in a setting with some significant percentage of Orthodox Jews, I code my language in such a way to indicate that I belong with them, that I speak their language too, so that somehow my words will be more accepted. I turn up the from speak, right? And we all do a version of that, which makes the following thing even more interesting. So, as you know, I have several books in front of me, including the Torah Chaim that we're reading out of. I also have this book that I quote from occasionally, which is not Pshuto Shel Rashi, but it's a Chumash called Pshuto Shel Mikra and Rashi Kipshuto, and he brings lots of interesting super commentaries and midrashim that are adjacent to what Rashi is dealing with, and he brings a really interesting one here. So, Muvah b'Midrash. It's brought in the Midrash in Shemot Rabbah, chapter 5, Mishnah Midrash 2, so close to the one that we were just referencing before. Amar Rabbi Chama. Rabbi Chama said, Ben 12 shana nitlash Moshe Rabbeinu mibeit aviv. We learned that Moses was 12 years old when he left his birth parents' home and came to live in the palace. Lama kain. Why? Why did the story not permit itself to be that he lingered longer with his family before he became Ben Bayit in the palace? She'ilu hayagadel beveit aviv, had he spent more time in his birth parents' home. Uva, and came, va'amar lehen l'Yisrael, and said to the Israelites, hamasim, all of these things, and used the key language of pakod pakati, lo hayu ma'aminim, they would have believed him less. Why? Shahayu omrim aviv masralo. They would have said, well, anyway, of course he's going to use language. We've been hearing for generations in our homes that a redeemer is going to come with pakod pakadati language. Lefish Yosef masral Levi, because Joseph passed it to Levi, but Levi lekahat, and Levi passed it to Kahat, and Kahat to Amram. Kahat passed it to Amram, and Amram is the father of Moshe. So according to one genealogy, Moshe is the great-great-great-great-grandson of the person who gave this language. Ulachach nitlash mibeit aviv. That's why he was plucked from that ancestral home young enough such that that when he came and said these things to the Israelites, they would believe him because they would know that's the only way he could have learned this language is not from his parents and grandparents, but there must have been a revelation. Quoting a chapter ahead, chapter 4, verse 31, they believed him. Why they believed him? Because there's no other way he would have had that inside baseball language. So it's not only an indication of the fact that pakadati has been passed through, but that Moshe needed plausible deniability to make his knowing that inside language more meaningful and therefore more believable. Okay. I I feel at some point I may have unintentionally cut off Joanna in the middle of your translating and commenting on the Rashi itself. Was there anything that you more wanted to say in that moment, Joanna?
No, I think we got to the end of that, Rashi.
Okay.
Good.
I also see there are now 11 things in the chat. Should I be paying attention to that? I have no idea. Your question, Joanna, at 9:31 to the two versions of Nikra. Aleph Hey would have been the same root letters in Egyptian or another standing word altogether. It's a good question. I do not know. Maybe Tova knows. I don't know. Okay, let's see. I had said in my email that I can stay another 13 minutes to make it more of an hour-long class. So if you can stay with me, great. If not, obviously people have made their schedules way in advance, and so I will not be insulted if you leave. Okay, the next words in our text is Rashi commenting on Nikra Aleinu, which we've been spending so much time on, I want to get to. But there are some versions. Does anybody have a version of Rashi in front of them where the next words in the Rashi commentary are not his commenting on Nikra Aleinu, but rather on Elohei HaIvriim? No? Okay. So I want to read this. This also comes from one of the many Rashi commentaries I have in front of me. This is.
I have it in mine.
You have it in yours, Barry? Okay. So in one of the books I have in front of me, it's attributed to Berashi Yashan, to an old Rashi. I don't know, an old manuscript of Rashi. What's interesting is usually because our version of the Torah Chaim is such a scholarly work, they've checked all the manuscripts and they include it, but put it in parentheses saying B'tfus Rishon Leita, right? It's not in the first printing. The fact that it doesn't appear even in parentheses in our text, by our I mean the one that most of us use, the Torah Chaim, suggests it's even less likely that it's Rashi, because it's just more suspect. If it had been less suspect, they would have included it an asterisk. The fact that it doesn't appear at all is strange, but I still want to read it because it's an interesting comment, even though it's probably not Rashi. So, Elohei HaIvriim, the God of the Hebrews. If you look at that word in the middle of 18, that's what he's commenting on. Lo ne'emar ha'ivrim. It doesn't say ivrim one yud, ella ha'ivriim, the two yud Hebrews. B'yud yetera. It's an extra yud, right? You could have said Elohei ha'ivrim, the God of the Hebrews. It's like ivri as an adjective means a Hebrew, and to pluralize that, you could just plural it as ivrim. This is ivriim. And what does the extra yud in Gematria is 10. Remez le'eser makot. This is a hint at the 10 plagues that God of the Hebrews is going to use to bring the Israelites out of Egypt, which brings us to something that Rashi is going to say on the next verse regarding how much force and power it's going to take to have this redemption take place. So it's a sweet. Rashi does not do a lot of gematria in general, so it makes sense that it wouldn't be Rashi. But I wanted to throw that in there, that there's this interpretation of the extra yud in the God of the Hebrews. Rick, your hand's up? Or was that from before?
Yes, hi. Just because you mentioned the plagues, that's the only big difference between 5:3 and where we are now is at the end of it, they go, if you don't let us go worship in the desert, pen yifka'enu badever uvacherev. So the plagues are there. So I think it's great that the plagues are here in the extra yud.
Yeah. And they're either there or they're not there. And sometimes an extra yud is just a cigar.
Right.
Okay. So now, Joanna, we're back to you with the next piece that is more certainly Rashi on Nikra Aleinu. And we spent so much interesting time on Pakod Yifkod that we probably will not complete our conversation on Nikra Aleinu, even though we've been setting it up now for a few weeks. So go ahead.
Nikra Aleinu Lashon Mikra, V'chein Vayikar Elohim, V'anochi Ekrako. Nikra Aleinu is the language of just a happening, I would translate it here.
Right. And the thing is there is probably mikre, right? The noun of the verb likrot is a mikre, a happening, a thing that took place.
Comparable to, and God happened.
Right. And so I want to give you the reference to that. I think Vered was pointing us to this a few minutes ago, and we were talking about it a few minutes before that. One of the places where this root is most interesting is in the interaction between God and the non-Hebrew prophet Bilam, who keeps getting visited by God. So that Vayikar Elohim in our verse is a shortening of Vayikar Elohim El Bilam, which is in the 23rd chapter of the book of Bamidbar, verse 4. So here you have it right in front of you. Vayikar Elohim El Bilam. I forgot which translation happens to be the standard translation on Safaria. Maybe it's old JPS. I don't think it's new JPS, but I don't even know what it is. God manifested himself to Balaam, Vayomer Elav, and the continuation of that. So Rashi brings this, and we also have a few verses later, Va'anochi Ikare Ko, which is an even more interesting construct. And wait till you see how this translated here. Vayomer El Balak, so Bilam, the prophet, says to Balak, the king who hired him, Hityatsev ko al olatecha, stay here amongst or kind of supervising your sacrifices, your offerings. Va'anochi ikareko, I will. It's a nifal. It's a future nifal of the root kara. It's so hard to render into English, and you can see that because look what it's done here. I seek a manifestation yonder. That almost sounds like a jokey translation, but it's an older fashioned English attempt to try to render the kuf resh hey in the future tense and somehow making sense of something simply happening by manifestation. But I'm the verb. I'm the subject of the verb, not God, right? Above, it was God as the subject. Now, maybe this is davening. I'm gonna seek manifestation yonder at Minyan. I'm gonna make myself available, possibly for a visitation by God by happenstance. Right? It's really an interesting thing going on. Larry, go ahead. Well, Larry, Diane, I don't know who's had their hand up.
Yeah. Alter goes even further.
Oops, sorry, I muted you by accident. Sorry, I was trying to lower your hand. Go ahead.
Okay, can you mean? Yeah, I'm on. Alter goes even further. He says, and he said to Balak, "Station yourself here by your burnt offering, and I myself shall so seek some chance. Chance as like gambling."
Yeah, it's really great. That's Alter on the verse in Numbers.
Yeah,
I will seek some chance.
It's just. It's absolutely, yeah. If I see that Aryeh Kaplan has anything interesting, I'll let you know.
It's really hard to do because the whole notion of kuf resh hey as simply happening suggests that it's happening to us. In fact, there's a super commentary in Rashi here that says this is a weird proof text for Rashi to bring because it suggests, the second of the two suggests that Bilam was in charge of that moment, which is the opposite of something happening. And so, in fact, most people believe that the reason why Rashi quotes the first one, Vayikar Elohim, and quotes the second one, Va'anochi Ikareko, but then he has to qualify the second one in those last 3 or 4 words that I'm not sure you translated yet, Joanna, or if you did translate again. Ehe nikre me'ito halom. How do you translate that?
That is to say, I will meet him over there.
Yeah, so the halom is either there or here, funny enough. And the way Rashi translates the ikare is an ehe nikre me'ito, I will allow myself to be met with him, something there, right? So lest you think, Rashi's saying, that by the fact that Bilam is the subject of this verb, he's the one making the appointment happen, he's simply making himself open to the possibility that the appointment will happen, but it's still God's happening to him, not him happening to God, right? It's actually a very complex idea, and I think it does relate to what we're trying to do in prayer, and in some ways more interesting to discuss it there than simply to figure out what God was communicating that Moshe should say to Pharaoh, right?
Can I just tell you that Aryeh Kaplan is very consistent and kind of supports, I think, what you're saying here. Remember, Aryeh Kaplan translated the Nikra back in Shemot as God revealed himself, right? That's how he did, instead of happened. And here he says in Bamidbar that Balaam says to Balak, and I will go yonder and seek a vision.
Seek a vision.
So in that sense, so if God reveals himself, we can be active in making ourselves available to see that revelation, to seek a vision.
Yeah, good. And I'll call on Barry in a second, but just look at what Rashi says on the verse in Bamidbar. This is now Rashi on that verse. Ikareko, which is, again, very hard to translate. Me'et HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I will be met there. Even me'et is hard. With, from, as a result of the Holy One. Ikare Lashon et Pa'el. He says this is not only it's not only passive, but it's passive reflexive. Et Pa'el. I will somehow allow myself to be met by God there. Lest you think that it's an active thing that Bilam is initiating. Barry?
So our difficulty with English and Hebrew to describe God's reality is that God's reality is outside of our languages. God introduced God's name as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. We had difficulty with that. We left it with difficulty. God's becoming is God's becoming, and that all began with the Beta Bereshit. Is the becoming is always the becoming, and we don't even know what this means. So God's appearance and our reality of God's appearance will be what God's appearance is.
Yes.
And you've tried to define it's impossible because it's outside of our language.
That's very helpful, Barry. I love the connecting back to Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. How will I be? I will be how I will be. How will I manifest? I will manifest how I will manifest. What will your experience of me be? Your experience of me will be your experience of me. Right? And anything more concrete than that is almost a diminution of God's godness. Lovely, Barry. Joanne, you get the last comment.
This whole thing that we're discussing about, who is making the appointment happen and who is showing up and how that relates to our prayer experience takes me to how we start our prayer experience. The very first words traditionally said when entering a shul are Matovu, Bilam's words. And it always kind of puzzled me, like, why choose his words? Not a Jewish prophet's words, from, so to speak, from outside our tradition to be the opening words. And it has new meaning for me now because in light of this discussion, maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to be thinking about when we say those words.
I've given the first 20% of that little sermonette many times, that look how wonderful that we are a particular tradition, but we're open to inspiration from the outside, and that when we walk into our very particular sanctuaries, we invoke a non-Hebrew prophet because his ability to bless the Israelites, we should be able to accept that blessing and emulate it. But you're taking it a step further. You're almost saying that based on this Ikare Kara conversation, Bilam is in his own way a paradigm for being in a prayerful place, open to God's voice and impact. I'm really moved by that. And I'll just, as a last comment, Everett Fox on that verse in Numbers, Va'anochi Ikareko, Anochi, as for me, I will, hyphenated, seek an encounter there. He turns Ikare into seek an encounter, which is a great verb and a great thing for us to have in mind the next time we stand to daven. We should all be seeking an encounter, which doesn't mean it's going to happen. We should be seeking it.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.